Welcome to the Ultimate Landscape CEO podcast. Our guest is Dr. Charlie Hall. Charlie, welcome to the show again.
I always like being invited back, so thanks very much for that, my friend.
I think this is a third time for you and me here.
Yeah.
And
Well,
plus,
you can't let too much moss grow under your feet because things change so quickly around here.
you darn tootin', man. We are going to talk today about, of course, the supply chain and the current outlook and future outlook. No doubt we'll talk about inflation. No doubt we'll talk about wages and employees and the cost pressures associated. And of course, we're going to take a look into the future. Charlie, do you want to just take a minute and tell people who maybe this is their first time tuning in a little bit about yourself? And what does it mean, international floriculture?
Well, it's an interesting story in and of itself. That's an endowed chair that I hold here at Texas A&M. And I joke around a lot and say, man, it's a nice chair. It raises up and down and reclines and everything. But this is really a faculty position here at Texas A&M that is solidified in perpetuity. In other words, budget cuts and everything can't make this particular position go away. So it's there because it's been endowed with 63 donors across the green industry contributed to this particular endowed chair. And while its focus was floriculture and folks within the floral industry, the bedding plants and perennials and so forth, they wanted a position that was going to look at that side of the business versus nursery or landscaping or garden centers. But they hired an economist who cross cuts every single sector. So while I spend an adequate amount of time in floriculture, I also spend a lot of time on other sectors as well. So I'm an economist by training, and all throughout my career, I've been in the ag economics departments at Tennessee, Mississippi State, here, and this time, because the endowed chair is actually in horticulture, I'm an economist in the horticulture department. So it makes sense because my entire academic career for 34 years now, I have strived to be on both sides of the fence and speak the horticulture language and the economics language. And that's been one of my, I think, competitive strengths in academia, is being able to speak both languages and put that to good use in my research and my outreach efforts.
So let's jump right into economics then, since you love it so much. I know you do a lot of speaking in the wintertime. I mean, all the time, really. So has your message changed a lot over the past 3 months? Have you noticed what you were saying 3 months ago is different from now?
Yeah. Interestingly, I was looking back at some of the presentations I did because I was backing up my hard drive and everything, and I was looking at different years. And I looked back to 2019 and my economic forecast that I was making at that particular point. Yeah. And I was saying that, in the absence of a black swan event, 2020 looks pretty good. Mm-hmm. And of course, I didn't know that black swan event was going to be COVID. Yes. And for this, I'd had that same message, Jeffrey, for the decade after the Great Recession and the recovery. We were growing very, very, very slowly. It didn't have to, you don't have to be an artist to draw that graph, because it's a very slow GDP growth, 1.8 to 2.4% annualized growth year over year. Economy just kind of growing at slow. It was kind of boring to be an economist. Yeah. And now, I think I was saying to myself back then, if only something would happen to spruce things up a little bit. Well, careful what you ask for, and don't blame it on me. But certainly this COVID situation has obviously changed our economic scenarios pretty dramatically, and there's still a great deal of uncertainty in the marketplace. Now, as you and I talked in our last podcast, even in the midst of uncertainty, there's lots of opportunities. So I think that's a key thing we'll keep in the back of our mind throughout this discussion as well, is that regardless of what Russia does over the next few days in terms of the Ukraine, regardless of how long it's going to take the supply chain to develop, that there are opportunities in our industry. And one of the reasons I say that is that one thing that surprised us very much was the fact that the consumer responded the way that they did. Now, historically, any economic downturn, we had seen a shot in the arm in the green industry, that folks stayed at home more. They would typically do more gardening and landscaping, which at the time was one of the top leisure time activities. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually keeps track of leisure time activities, and they do a very extensive household survey. And gardening and landscaping now is not even in the top 10 leisure time activities. That's what made 2020, when we were not essential and the world was falling apart in the green industry, we were just going to be, we'd dry up and blow away. And then all of a sudden we were deemed to be essential, and people started buying lawn and garden products. They started buying landscape services because they couldn't go to the bars and the restaurants and buy other personal services, but they could hire a landscaper. So the landscaper could come in, they could social distance. You didn't have to meet face to face with the client, or you didn't have to be right there in their face. So landscaping service is one of those things that one of the service sectors that actually did pretty well during COVID. And of course, those retail garden centers that had product did very well once they were deemed to be essential. In Michigan, when nobody was essential during March and April and part of May, it's hard to make up those spring sales all in one fell swoop. So there were parts of the country that, even though 2020 ended up and everybody had a nice stockpile of working capital by the end of 2020, there were still some firms that didn't do so well in 2020. And some that
2020 was a mixed year. 2021 was all right, guys. Everyone's kind of putting their pedal to the metal. Let's just jump with your prediction, and then we'll get into details.
Sure.
What's your prediction for 2022?
All right, for 2022, obviously the supply chain is the key thing. It is the driver of this whole engine. And so as the supply chain goes, so does the inflationary pressures. So the supply chain is very critical in this process. And I'm expecting it's going to take the entire year for the supply chain wrinkles to get ironed out. Now, in our last podcast, I said mid to 2022 is what my forecast was. But we've had a few developments since then. And we've made 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And, it's going to take roughly the rest of the year for the supply chain to get back to somewhat normal. And that's if we don't have some sort of Ukraine war going on and so forth, because Russia produces about 40% of the oil and natural gas for the global market. So they're an important player, mostly for Europe, not for us.
Yeah.
So we're kind of buffered because we've got some emergency supplies, and we don't have to export as much natural gas as what we've been exporting. So we can keep our cards close to our chest and make it a little bit better.
Do you think the Democrats will open up the spigots here at home?
I think they'll be forced to, right? And because particularly going in, it's the midterm elections coming up. And one of the things and we don't have to talk politics, we talk policies, but one of the things that obviously going into a midterm election, you don't want an inflation of 7%, because, the other side of the fence is pointing at the side of the fence that's in control and saying it's your fault, in spite of the fact it was the other side of the fence and the slow, the policy making in terms of COVID response initially that caused some of the snafus in the supply chain early on. So when particularly for the driving schools, because we had a shortage of truck drivers 4 years ago, and we started pumping more people, the truck driver salaries started increasing to respectable levels. I mean, $80,000 starting, you go through driving school and you can start making that kind of money from the get-go. So we were drawing people into the business, and we were down from 100,000 only down to about 46,000 drivers short pre-COVID. And then by the end of 2021, we were back up to 80,000 drivers short. And with the tonnage that's expected to get all those container ships in, and interestingly, people are opting to take product out of those containers and ship it by truck rather than rail. The intermodal data on rail shipments is way down, about 8% from normal. So that's put even more pressure on the trucking sector. And so we're going to continue seeing that pressure on the entire supply chain because we don't have enough containers, we don't have enough reefers, we don't have enough drivers. And it's a true bottleneck. And it'll take a little bit of finagling here to get the supply chain back where it needs to be.
So
now,
you said that would get worked out by the end of the year. Do you think also those domestic issues will get worked out by the end of the year?
As those wrinkles get ironed out, yes, much of that inflationary pressure dies down, but we got to have some other policies come into play here, particularly by the Fed. And so the FOMC and their March meeting, which is coming up in about 3 weeks or so.
FOMC, you have
the Federal Open Market Committee. That's when the governors from all the Federal Reserve offices come in and they do their big powwow. So that's the FOMC. And then at the end, Jay Powell comes out and makes his speech. And then the stock market does what it's going to do for the next 2 or 3 days because they always respond. And so I would expect that we're going to see some interest rate increases this year. Yep. Now we can dive into that now, or we can come circle back around to it later, but we're going to have to, because we got to pull back on demand, because consumer purchasing has been redonkulously strong. Now that's the technical term, right? Redonkulously. Yeah. I just made that up, redonkulous, but I'm added ly to it. Anyway, I'm allowed to do that. PhDs, you can make up your own words. Listen to this stat. The 10 years after the Great Recession, from where we were at 2007, right before the Great Recession, it took us 9 years for retail sales. That's retail sales of all products, not just lawn and garden. Retail sales to increase 21.4%. All right, so remember that number. It took us 9 years after the Great Recession, and all that took 9 years to get back to have an increase. We grew retail sales in 21 months during COVID, 21.4%, the exact same percentage. So in 21 months, we spent the daylights out of our stuff because we got the CARES Act, we got child tax credit, American Rescue Plan, those stimulative policies. Well, by golly, the consumer knows how to spend, and we've always said that consumer spending represents close to 70% of GDP. Well, it hit it, right? It hit when it surpassed it. So that's part of what's driving final demand. Is you got consumers with some relief in their pockets. They couldn't buy services, so they just we're still going to buy. We got Amazon, right? E-commerce sales had 5 years worth of growth in 1 year. So again, how does that product get to the consumer? You got to have trucks. So you see this perfect storm of these interactive things happening, and so when you pull up to the gas pump and you see a sticker there, like I did the other day, said, "Thank you, President Biden, for the high gas prices." There's a disconnect there, right? That's the politics that's coming into play. What folks need to realize is that we took a global supply chain that was just in time in nature, because we spent 4 decades perfecting this. Yeah. And I said this in both of the previous podcasts, and I'm going to say it again. And we threw a global pandemic on top of it. you're going to have some wrinkles develop. And so you can't have that kind of shutdown worldwide and there not be repercussions, because there were major ports in China and so forth, that in India, that were shut down, and your product couldn't get out. The demand was there, so we used up inventory. Then when you use up inventory, then manufacturers have no choice but to try to manufacture as fast as they can. And so they needed inputs. Well, the inputs were scarce because shipments were slow. So the price of those inputs went up. So then manufacturers are producing, higher cost of inputs, higher prices at the retail level. So this is the inflationary pressure. So it's not, we used to say as economists, is this a cost push inflation? Is this a wage push inflation? Or is this a demand pull inflation? And the answer is yes. It's all three. I mean, this is just like the Great Recession was rewriting the financial textbooks. We're right back at it. We're seeing all three elements of inflation rearing its ugly head. And we've not seen this kind of inflationary pressure. That's why people don't know how to react to it from a business standpoint.
So let me just ask you a question. So your prediction is that the supply chain in 12 months or 10 months will be back to normal, will be 90%?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, I can't put exact percentage on that, but we will have made significant strides in getting on both the seaboards, the Western seaboard, LA and so forth, and then Charleston, Savannah, all those seaports. We will have gotten a lot of those ships through the system, unclogging it, and products in place at retail. Right.
But what about at the manufacturing level? Just getting even the chips to the car manufacturers so they can produce their cars. How long is that going to take? Yeah,
it's going to take longer, because there's this backlog of demand, and we're trying to fill that. And at the same time, there are efforts to de-risk the supply chain, and stuff that we have outsourced before, we're going to insource. I mean, we're building, what is it, 2 semiconductor plants.
That could take 5 years. I mean, or even longer.
I know. So we're not.
So let's go back to the chips. How long will that take before all the car manufacturers have all the chips they need?
Yeah, that's a good question. If we could take all the chips out of the hundreds of Porsches that are burning in the ocean right now, that alleviate some. Man, that hurts right there when you see those fine vehicles burning at sea. But anyway, it's going to take a little while on the chip side, and most of the pundits there, they do look out 2 to 3 years before we get back to where we can produce at the supply and demand.
So that could be 3 years out, you're saying?
It could be. Yeah. So there's still going to be some inflationary pressures. We just won't see the year-over-year growth in the 7% range like what we've seen.
You mean inflation? Is that what you just said?
Yeah. So the inflation over the last decade has been 1.75.
No, I get you, but that's been too low. It should be what, 3.5% roughly?
Well, normally you would think it was between 2 and 3%.
Yeah.
Right. And then when it gets above that 2%, that's when you normally see the Federal Reserve start ratcheting up the interest rates. And then that curbs final demand. And so that puts the squelch on the demand side. So the supply side responds, and then everything, inflation is held in check. That's the way it's supposed to operate. But right now we've had 0.25% interest rates in terms of our, the federal funds rate.
I guess what I'm saying is we can survive with 3 to 4% inflation.
Oh yeah.
Even though 7% sounds like a 5-alarm fire, 3.5% would be just fine.
Yeah. In fact, the Federal Reserve's already said that that 2% target that they've been using forever.
Yeah.
Now it's a range. Now they didn't tell us what exactly the range is,
but
now they're not sticking to that strict 2% trigger.
what do you, I was going to call you on this off the podcast and make a suggestion. We can talk about it after, but um, my suggestion is that, well, I'll talk about it now a little bit. We need you know how the government measures inflation through some basket. We need a landscape basket so we know nationwide what the real inflation rate is to run your landscape business. Having said that, I'm going to put you on this, which I think is a great idea, but I'm going to put you on the spot. What do you think the real inflation rate has been?
Well, I can tell you exactly what it's been because I do measure that, right? And I mentioned this just off the cuff in our last podcast. But at the grower level, I calculate an index of prices paid by growers. And I take all the containers, all the media, the soil mixes, all the fertilizers, plant protection products, all the labor, freight and trucking, all those inputs that represent their cost of goods. And I weight each input by its relative importance within the overall cost of goods.
Yeah.
And then I have an econometric model for each one of those items, forecasting what the increase is going to be. I take that increase, multiply it times the weight, and come up with a single number. And I just updated that for 2021 and my forecast for 2022. It was 9.8% was the weighted year over year increase from 2021 over 2020. All right. So, okay. And then for 2022, we're looking at another 5%, 4.8% increase in those inputs.
So you said roughly 10% last year.
Yeah, roughly 10%, roughly 5% this year.
For the landscape business owner.
Okay, so those costs then have to be, they go up through the supply chain. Yeah. And then the retailers got to mark up, the landscapers got to do their markup, whether it's the dual overhead recovery system that Frank Ross talks about, or the multiple overhead recovery system that Vanderkooy has talked about, or the Jim Houston overhead and profit per hour. Whatever system you use, you got to mark it up, and then you got to price your labor right, and then you got to recover overhead, right? And I'm preaching to the choir here because I know you guys talk about this all the time in terms of making money in the landscape business. But if those guys, they have to at least mark up another 15% to cover those additional costs that the growers are going to pass on. And supposedly they're going to have a profit margin built in as well. So that means that it's got to be in the 25% range, that the landscapers got to increase the price of their services in order to cover labor and materials and general conditions, costs, and so forth and so on.
I think it would be interesting, and maybe this isn't your purview, but somebody should be measuring the cost of goods in the, basically in the landscape chart of accounts. And maybe you don't pick every item, but certainly labor and materials and insurance and equipment related. But it would be interesting for someone to take that on. I know you're a little bit more on the grower side, but maybe there's a project there for us.
Well, we need to talk about that offline, because as part of this Your Market Metrics program that doing all the benchmarking and collecting income statement, balance sheet data from growers, we have a corollary program on the retail side, but we don't have a corollary program on the landscape side.
Okay, we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
So we were talking about inflation, 7 point something, right? As of January. And so that's this January to last January. Where do you think it'll end up this year?
Probably in the 4.5 to 5 range. If I'm dartboarding right now.
So just to be clear, so if we fast forward to next January or February, you think the look back will be 4.5%?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a very comfortable, confident number.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you think we've hit the peak, basically?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're like Jay Powell in a way. Oh, actually, before you don't answer that, what's your grade of Jay Powell? How well has he done? What grade do you give him?
I give him a B+. Yeah. I would I think Bernanke and Yellen after Bernanke, and then Powell, I think they've had similar outlooks, very markedly different than Greenspan and Volcker and previous Federal Reserve chairpersons. When we were really trying to foster an environment to get people into houses, because the housing was what was driving the economic engine at that point in time. And it's still an important part of the economic engine, but we know in hindsight, we were putting too much coal on the fire, and it was a bubble waiting to burst. And so that's what happened with the Great Recession. And then we had very little regulatory oversight in the financial sector. So there were some things that were being done, again, to put people in houses that didn't necessarily have the credit to deserve to be in those houses. And so we paid the price for it. But this time around, I think Jay Powell has been very cautious. He's moved less aggressively than I think other governors and other districts of the Federal Reserve would have liked to have seen him move. But this is, I mean, it's like steering the Titanic, right? It's a 22.9, almost a $23 trillion economy that you're trying to manipulate here. And all of a sudden, remember, 21 months of growth in retail sales. I mean, 20 to 21.4% in 21 months. Who would have figured that we could expand retail sales by 21.4% in less than 2 years, when it had taken years previously to see that level of rise in retail sales? So yeah. I'm not blaming Jay Powell, because there's nobody in there that could have foreseen the final demand increasing at that kind of rate. Now,
so you give him a B+. What did he do well, and where could he have done better to get an A?
Yeah. I think he's been very patient, but I think they've waited a little bit too long to raise rates, and I don't think there's a pride factor. They had been saying it's going to be 2023 until they raise interest rates. And in fact, you and I think in our first podcast we talked about that. In fact, it's cheap money if you need to make strategic investments in your landscape business from a CapEx standpoint, or paying down long-term debt, whatever. It's cheap money right now. So now's a good time to make those strategic investments. So, but I think he could have been more aggressive earlier and already started the pipeline in terms of raising rates. So my conjecture is that they'll go into the March meeting, they'll come out with 25 basis points, maybe even 50, but I'm thinking 25.
That's a quarter of a percent for people listening.
I know.
Or half a percent.
I know. 25 basis points in March, another 25 in April. And then they'll probably go, they'll skip a month and we'll see how that plays out. In June, they'll probably come back with another 25 basis points. And again,
so a quarter point each quarter.
Each time. Yeah. They'll wait the summer to see how the summer plays out. And then they'll come right back in September with another 25 and another 25 in December. And so now by that time, the federal funds rate will be 1.5%. Yep. That's still ridiculously cheap money.
Yeah, it is.
So they'll probably come back with 25 basis points each quarter next year, first 3 quarters at least.
So you said he could have gone faster. And I was thinking about this, I think about this stuff all the time anyways, but in anticipation of this podcast, it seems to me their job, the Fed chair's job, is to move slow. Like that's really one of their jobs, is not to, because you just said it's a $23 trillion
economy. Yeah.
So it seems to me one of their jobs is to go slow, because I was thinking, aren't they always late to the party every time there's a crisis? Not a fast reaction to save the economy. They've been very good the last 2 times, but in general, they're always slow. And so in my mind, that just must be their job, is to go slow, because this just seems like they get a B+ every time, or worse, but because God, in hindsight, they could have gone faster. But I'm making a statement, but also asking a question. Isn't that maybe their job, is to go a little bit slow?
Well, yes, the patience is one of their virtues. I'll say that. But here's the key difference. That 21.4% increase in retail sales When
Yeah.
you saw retail sales tracking at that pace,
Yeah.
and then you saw, I mean, even every single supply chain indicator, you can take, there's several indicators that talk about how fast the product moves through the supply chain. There's several indicators that show the volume of movement that's coming through the supply chain. There's different indicators about the cost of all the way through the supply chain.
You're talking about leading indicators versus lagging indicators.
Both. Some are leading, some are lagging. Most are lagging. All right. There's very few leading that are really predictive in nature. And then there's a whole set of indicators that look at the inventory and how the inventory builds and how quickly inventory is coming back. And then lastly, a whole set of indicators on manufacturing, distribution jobs and the wage levels, et cetera. So you look at all those indicators, and while they were mostly, if you look at it like a red light, red, yellow, green, right? So green is good, red is not so good, and yellow is just kind of mixed. Well, we were in the greenish, a little bit of yellow here and there went before the pandemic. So we were, freight rates were rising, but they weren't really a big problem. We knew that tonnage was going to be increasing, but still now all of those indicators are either still red or they're yellow, right? So we got very few, some in the inventory, where some sectors are able to build inventory quicker than others because the inputs are more accessible than others. Or they're accessible, we haven't outsourced, and there's not as globalized in those sectors. So, which, by the way, just popped in my brain, so it's going to come out my mouth, is that there's a concept called GDD, gross domestic demand, which basically takes the fourth component out of GDP. You got what you and I spend, what businesses invest and spend, and then government expenditures, and then the net balance between imports and exports. Those are the four major parts of GDP. You take the imports and exports out of the equation, GDD, we're back to trend. Where we were in terms of the trend line before COVID, we're back on trend. But if you look at GDP, the imports and exports, we're still 15% down below trend.
Yeah.
Even with the significant growth in GDP that we've had, and real GDP is higher than what it was pre-COVID at this point, but it's still not up to trend, right? There's that gap, and we call that the demand gap.
Yeah.
And so there's still that demand gap of 15%. We're not back on trend, but we're above where we were.
So I want to get back to this. We're giving him a B+. You said he could have gone faster. Something in my mind, I wish the Fed had like one of my landscape peer groups that they talk to. Because if they talk to real world companies, they would have, you said inflation is 7.5, it's going down to 4, but the landscape inflation is a lot higher. So two-part question, where do you think landscape inflation will end at the end of the year? And why doesn't the Fed use real world data? What is the data they're using that averages out to only 7% or 4%?
No, it is real world data. I mean, all that GDP data is coming from multiple household surveys.
So why is the landscape company basket of goods experiencing such higher inflation?
Yeah, it varies by sector. And in fact, where was I seeing that? It's mostly in the leisure and hospitality sectors and the energy sectors that have the highest inflationary rates. And then some of the other sectors, the bottom dweller sectors, that I can't think of right off the top of my head.
Okay. You're saying it averages out, but food's up?
Mining and logging, for example. I mean, that didn't make any difference. There was not much inflation in the mining industry or the logging industry and so forth. Gotcha. But remember I said at the grower level, all those sets of inputs, 10% increase. And it's because we get our soil mixes from various parts of the world. We get our containers, the resin and so forth that the containers are made out of. And all that was in a just-in-time basis. And so container manufacturers couldn't produce product fast enough. And even if landscapers are using ellie pots instead of plastic containers, there's still media that's got to go in there. Where does that media come from? What comes from Canada? It comes from France. It comes from, there's not that much domestically that's produced. So that's one of the things that's influencing the green industry cost of goods. And therefore that feeds up to landscapers, is the fact that many of our products are not produced here in the US.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And a big driver, of course, is labor. And if you look at labor rates, of course, you can look at the employment cost index from all the way from when Reagan left office, and you can see the downward slope in employment cost up until about 2014. And then you start seeing gradual wage pressure through 17, 18, and then you got a steeper slope in terms of wages. But here's what's interesting. If you look at that employment cost index, which is, it's indexing the cost of employing people by businesses, we're roughly where we were in 1984. So you saw wages decrease for decades in real dollars. And now we're playing the great catch up. So the problem is that we're catching up in such a short period of time. It hurts. It hurts businesses because the wage pressure is rising so rapidly.
Real wages went down. Is that due to globalization of labor?
Yes. Automation, mechanization, globalization, all those factors. And we imported fewer people, right, over that time period. So anyway, and now we're seeing that great catch up.
So just in time is basically unraveled. People want to produce more things closer to home. We'll see. My great hope for our society is we bring back all the semiconductor production over the next 10 years. That's my big hope long-term for my kids that happens. But putting that aside, so that's going to happen. We're going to produce more locally, a bit more. Just in time will unravel. And so that's going to cause this ongoing wage pressure. What else will cause it?
Well, the fact that you got so many jobs right now, we lost 22.5, 22.4 million jobs because of right at the start of COVID. And we're still about 4 million short, but we've hired a lot. But if you look at the quits rate, there's still a lot of people quitting jobs, and there's still there's a lot more jobs available than there are people to fill those jobs because the participation rate went down.
Yeah.
Well, why did it go down? Well, who's missing from the pie right now? 34% of that pie that's missing is women. We still don't have the same number of women in the workforce as what we did pre-COVID.
Interesting.
The other is the folks 65 and older. Yeah. So that we had about 1.5 million to 2 million excess retirements during this time period. Early retirement. That's right. So, and then the third big component there is the number of people starting businesses, the entrepreneurial stance. Because again, this is a life-changing pandemic. People reevaluating what they want to do with their lives. There are a bunch of folks. In fact, we were at about 200,000 entrepreneurial businesses started, consistently through Obama years, Trump years. We got a little bit of a bump right there in 18, 19 with the our tax cut back in 2017. Got a little bit more that entrepreneurial flavor, and then spike. I mean, off the chart during the pandemic. People starting their businesses during the pandemic, thinking, you know what? And surveys had showed that the 31% of the folks out there said, I'm not going back to work at the same hours and the same pay because they don't care about me. Why should I go back to this type of business? I've always wanted to do this, XYZ. So I wanted to go and start XYZ business.
You said women, older people, and then people left to start their own businesses. So a year from now, what do you think the labor market's going to look like?
Well, a third of those businesses are going to fail right? We know that in the first couple of years. So they're going to be back in the job market. We're going to see if we can get, well, is Build Back Better going to be passed or not? That's
No.
all right. You flip a coin on that one. So if there's some childcare provisions in there that would bring women back to the workplace quicker,
Okay.
but if it doesn't pass, then you still have women juggling these multiple responsibilities.
Unless they pass it as a separate bill, but okay.
It could be. They are going to break it up. You're exactly right. They're going to break up Build Back Better and maybe pass pieces of it that they can get bipartisan buy-in. So, and then we will see some of those retirees, their wife's going to say, get your butt out of here and get back to work. I'm being facetious there, but we do see that some amount of retirees will be drawn back in, sometimes maybe because of the higher salaries. But I don't think we'll see this pressure, particularly in the horticulture sector, decrease, because the Farm Labor Survey, if you look at the all across all crop and livestock workers, and we don't have a horticulture survey, right? So that's the only survey that I can look at besides the employment cost index, which is non-ag jobs. And right now the average wage is $15.77 for field and livestock workers across the board. Mm-hmm. And that's at the field level. And so that's pretty significant. The problem has been in H-2A labor rates. So it's tied to the Farm Labor Survey. And so every April and November, USDA does a survey to see how fast those wages have increased. And when they do the survey, it's almost like they're building on the average each year. So it's like each year there's the Lake Wobegon effect, and everybody's above average. And so the agricultural H-2A wages have increased at a faster rate than non-ag rates. And therefore, when the H-2A rates start increasing, then that's when you see this drawing up on domestic worker wages as well. Right. And it's the same thing with H-2B, right? Sure. Those rates kind of draw up the minimum crew wage over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you have a prediction? Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
Well, I think those wage rates are still going to be something that we'll have to contend with. And that's why that's the bulk of that 5% increase is, the increases in fertilizer prices this year, and labor still coming in at 7% year over year increase in terms of what those wages. Those are the big main drivers in addition to trucking. Those are the three main drivers right now. And traditionally, I don't even worry about fertilizer. And I'm not that worried now because fertilizer is just a small drop in the bucket. Remember, this is a weighted average.
Unless you run a lawn care business, and in some places they went up like what, 30%, 25%?
Yes. Yeah. And that hurts the lawn service business. You're exactly right.
Yeah. All politics is local, as they say.
Indeed.
So we were talking about labor. A year from now, you think it's going to get better, and then you talked about it, but with higher wages still.
I think that the rate at which wages have been increasing will slow.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay. This is a dumb question, but hey, we got to ask it. Any prediction on H-2B? Do you think the government, let's talk about policy over politics.
Yeah.
Will the government get together and formulate a policy that will improve H-2B? Yeah. Any predictions?
Well, our good friend Craig Regelbrugge for American Hort. I mean, basically what he's saying right now is that there is bipartisan support to make some changes both in H-2A and H-2B to make them a heck of a lot more realistic than just offering 66,000 jobs, which are taken up in a matter of hours on the H-2B side, right? So we got it. They know that there's some reform that needs to be done, and he says that there is bipartisan support for doing that, but you got to get on the docket. You got to play the game in terms of getting in there, and that's what's the big unknown.
I want to say a couple of political things here. These may be people may write me hate mail after this, but It seems like politically we don't get stuff done without like an external enemy. And so as bad as this whole Russia thing is, I feel like our government's gotten to the point where we need this external enemy to rally around.
To stop fighting among ourselves.
Yes.
Yeah. To direct our aggression towards somebody else for once rather than each other.
That, and then to get us to work together. So
Yeah.
this is terrible to say, but I don't see it as a bad thing. I just want to, a wholly bad thing. Yes, it's bad in many ways, but not wholly bad. I want to talk about China a little bit. So you know how they reversed the whole one child policy, and now there's 2 child and 3 children.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But they predicted that, you know, at some point their population will not only stop but reverse and crater to like 750 billion or something. And do I have the millions or million, whatever it is? Or from 1 billion to 750 million. Which, I mean, China is eating our lunch, but at some point they're gonna disintegrate if that actually happens.
Yeah, I've been saying that for years. And there was great speculation that China was going to be the next world's super economic power.
Well, they will, but they're going to lose it quickly after that if that happens.
I don't think they even have the infrastructure right now. Well, I don't think they have the people to maintain the infrastructure that they have right now. Last time I was in China, the only time I was in China,
yeah,
there were entire apartment buildings empty. There were entire retail skyscrapers empty. Yeah. I saw a 1 million square foot greenhouse, nothing in it. They were building because they don't have any sort of there's no
people busy. You're saying
exactly keeping people busy and food in their stomachs. And
so I just want to go back to what you said about importing. I hope that the U.S. actually starts importing people. That was a funny phrase you used, but we have to keep our population on the plus side. It's been sort of the magic behind our engine, and I think we have to keep doing that, even while China at some point peaks out and reverses.
Yeah, I have been known to say that. Well, that's one of the reasons Russia lost the Cold War. They ran out of young people. Now, we carried a slightly bigger stick than what they did, but that's not really why they lost the Cold War. It's because they ran out of people.
Yeah.
And so they couldn't sustain the infrastructure. And then the same thing will happen to China. They don't have, unless they start importing people, that same thing will happen to them. And so that's why the rhetoric about building a wall, I mean, in theory, it sounds good about protecting jobs and all that. But if you look at Bill Clinton had the best economic growth of any president within the last 10. Why? NAFTA. We started importing people, and GDP is a product of productivity and number of people working. So within agriculture and within horticulture, if we don't need to build a wall, we need to charter buses. Right. So if we had more people working, then in the housing sector, this isn't just for horticulture, the housing industry, the growth that they were projecting was based off of us having a comprehensive immigration program that was passed back in 2006, which didn't happen. It was this close, but it didn't happen. And so that growth has been metered back because we don't have population growth. If you look at the number of live births data that we've had over the last 6 years, it's gone down dramatically, right? So fast forward 20 years, and we have fewer people than what's in the Gen X generation right now. So you got boomers, and you got 11 million fewer Xers, and you got 84 million millennials. And then from Gen Z back is the declining birth rates. The only way you can either start having more babies or you got to import people.
Yeah.
That's the whole economic engine right there, unless you have robotics and everything that replaces humans, but we're not there yet.
Well, that's interesting. If that will alter that math, that's the topic of a separate podcast, I'm sure. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. We have a few more minutes here. What did we not cover? Spring consumer outlook. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah. In fact, That's the one question I can't really answer with any degree of certainty, because I didn't expect 2021 for the lawn and garden consumer that's either buying DIY or buying landscape services. I did not expect them to have that as much year over year increases as we saw on the retail side in terms of transaction count or customer count, dollars per transaction, overall sales, gross sales, increases in gross margin dollars on the retail side. The landscapers, I don't know, did any landscaper whittle down their client list that's backed up for their backlog for 6 months? I don't know. Have they caught up yet? I don't know many that have caught up. Maybe you tell me.
Couple have caught up, most have not.
All right. So there's still a backlog of demand there on the landscape side. So if we look into 2022, again, well, we're going to have an even greater year over year increase in 22 over 21 as we saw 21 over 20. I don't know. However, most surveys, when they ask people, what do you plan on spending? 28% said they were planning on spending more than what they did back in 2021 on their gardening and landscaping activities. Now that includes services in there, and it's mostly to when you ask them about the types of home improvements, it's things that enhance the quality of their lives, their entertainment capacity, the aesthetics of their patios, porches, so forth, the hardscape. So I think there's going to be plenty of that landscape service business to go around. Just first of all, we got this backlog of stuff that we've got coming into spring that's going to artificially, keep us until March or April. But even after that, I think this spring is going to be really pretty good. But I can't really predict with a lot of certainty about 23, 24, 25, because there's just too many unknowns right now.
Yeah. A lot of ups and downs for sure.
Yeah.
Anything else we didn't cover you wanted to touch on? Supply chain, inflation, wages?
Well, consumer confidence went down this month. I very rarely check in on consumer confidence because confidence goes up and down and so forth. And we had 21.4% increase in what we bought during COVID, and confidence was all over the map during COVID, depending on whether there's a Delta outbreak or Omicron outbreak and so forth. So I don't really pay much attention to the confidence numbers. I pay attention to how people are spending their money. So will these black swan events like Russia, will that cause people to pull back? Not in the short run. So I think we'll get enough push through in spring that it's going to be good for everybody in this spring.
They're obviously it's going to impact energy, but maybe that will restart our energy production.
Could be.
For every response, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
You drive down the road here in Texas and there's oil rigs that are not moving, right? They've been sidelined. So exactly right. That when you see that dollar per barrel go up, particularly near $100 a barrel, you start seeing these things start moving pretty quickly then. So I think you're exactly right.
All right.
Now,
so
we got to have the refining capacity, which is a whole other issue. But fortunately, we've not had any week-long 5-degree temperatures here in Texas to freeze all of our refineries and set us back again.
Yeah. Luckily, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, your predictions. Let's summarize here. I'm gonna go from memory. Inflation a year from now down to 4%.
Well, I said 4.5, but
4.5. Good. 4.5%. That's like from 7.5 or whatever it was to 4.5. Where you're saying that that basically wages are even with where they were in the 70s.
1984.
And so really we've caught up, this whole idea of, right, there was that whole issue of minimum wage not moving for years, and well, there you go, it just moved. So you talked about people coming back in the workforce, retired, people who started their business, women one way or the other, I mean, I think that's connected to schools as well, right?
I do
So,
too. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
when the pandemic flushes through and maybe the Biden strips out that part of the Build Back Better that helps women back in the workforce, you think H2B has a glimmer of a hope of some kind of a unified
Mhm.
policy around that? All right. So
Mhm.
those are fairly optimistic. You said a year out, we would work through normal supplies in terms of moving supplies locally, but could be 3 years before the truck industry and global supply chain with critical elements like microchips. And of course, you heard me say I'd like to get microchip manufacturing back here, but that's a 10-year proposition. Anything else? Any other good news, bad news?
Well, again, just a caution for wherever somebody resides within the green industry and this working capital that we've been generating, the cash flow that we've been generating.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only three main buckets that you can put it in. You can pay down long-term debt, you can invest in CapEx, or you can invest in tradable assets. And for those that make stuff, that's building inventory. For those that provide services, that's adding another crew. That's adding another another crew, holding another set of equipment and so forth, and investing in your overall capabilities and building your business that way. You got to choose wisely between those buckets right now. If you build your business too quickly right now, and then we see a correction and you're over leveraged, you've gained nothing, right? So you got to be careful about which of those buckets, in terms of paying down long-term debt, investing CapEx, and either building inventory or building the level of services you're able to provide. So you got to make that decision wisely about how to use that working capital.
I think PPP in the forgiveness of these government monies has made contractors feel, some contractors, falsely confident. So their balance sheets got improved, but I think some P&Ls didn't get improved in spite of the growth, right? It's been very chaotic, the growth. And so in my financial masterclass, I looked at 150 P&Ls. Balance sheets definitely went up, but P&L improvement, it went up in some areas and down in some areas. And so to your point about being wise, I think there's been a bit of false security. And then if you're younger, there's a bit of, God, there's only one direction, it's up. So I think for the younger, certainly the younger entrepreneur, but also maybe the entrepreneur that doesn't really have their financial house in order, can't just go surfing on government money and think it's going to be there forever. And even if they don't realize they're doing that, some of that is happening.
Yeah. I could not have said it better myself. Well done.
Thank you. So one final thought for people as they want to, because everybody wants to grow as an entrepreneur. And I gave this sort of closing comment on the second in command event I just did recently, and urged people to become better, not bigger. Because better companies will easily become bigger, and it'll happen from strength to strength. But if you just aim to become bigger, you're not necessarily getting better. And just like you said about the growth that happens without thoughtfulness, if you aim to get better, you may or may not get bigger. I'm sorry, if you aim to get bigger only, you may or may not get better. You might even get a little worse. I mean, it's disconnected. But if you aim to get better, you're going to grow bigger in a stronger fashion. So
yeah, I agree with that. We call that both economies of scale and economies of scope. But if what you're using your terminology of if you get bigger without getting better, that's diseconomies of scope. And so you're actually decreasing in your capabilities of turning the bottom line.
See, you need a PhD to interpret that last one. All right. Dr. Charlie, now that I've moved down south, we don't use last names. It's just Dr. Charlie.
Yeah.
Mr. Jeffrey. I'm learning the terminology here. Dr. Charlie, thank you so much for your time and wisdom.
You're welcome. Great to talk to you, my friend.
Thank you.